This is championship weekend at Wimbledon. Any other tennis fans here? Tennis fans, Wimbledon? A few of you, but not many. Okay, I'm a little worried. I've never been to Wimbledon. It is on my bucket list. I plan to go at some point. I love Wimbledon in July. This year's tournament has not disappointed. The women's final was yesterday. It was not at all surprising that six-seeded Ons Jabeur from Tunisia was in the final. She's been one of the best players on the grass surface for years. If she had won, and she didn't win, but if she had won, she would have been the first Arab woman and the first African to win Wimbledon. I was rooting for her. She's an amazing person. Her opponent was unseeded Markéta Vondrousova from the Czech Republic, also an amazing athlete. Vondrousova, at last year's Wimbledon, was a tourist. She was just watching. Her arm was in a cast. She had just had surgery. She has been to Wimbledon on 4 previous occasions, and in all 4 visits to Wimbledon, she'd won 1 match total. No one expected her to go very far at this year's Wimbledon. No one expected her to make the finals, and no one expected her to beat Jabeur 6-4, 6-4, straight sets like she did. It has been a riveting, unpredictable 2 weeks on the women's side. You may not think I'm preaching yet, but I promise you I am. Just wait. The men's final is happening right now between Serbia's Novak Djokovic and Carlos Alcaraz of Spain. Last I checked just a few moments ago, it was... Okay. Thank you, Lydia Jeter, because that was my next point. I do not want to know. I'm recording this. I know where it is in the second set. It's exciting. If you are checking in on your phone, good for you. Do not give me hand signals. Do not begin facial gestures. I don't want to know. I'm going to watch it later, okay? You may be excommunicated if you violate this rule. If Djokovic wins today, that gives him 24 major titles, surpassing both Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal. I happen to be rooting for Alcaraz, but I just want to see a great match. Okay, so you may or may not be a tennis fan, and by show of hands, not many of us are all that passionate tennis fans. You may or may not like watching sports. But in a world where so much of our lives is predictable and scripted, the arena of sport offers us the excitement of the unpredictable and the unknowable. You cannot script a World Series or a Super Bowl or a Wimbledon finals or an Olympic event or any kind of sporting event. In a strange way, watching sports fills a strange need to face something not just unpredictable, but literally uncontrollable. Can you feel me sliding into a sermon here? That's the argument that sociologist Harmut Rosa makes in his book, The Uncontrollability of the World. Rosa argues that uncontrollability is a part of life, and yet one important feature of our modern lives is this desire for control across a wide range of life spheres. Weather, we want to predict and control. Insurance, economic markets, parenting, we want some control. And when we allow our lives to be shaped by this modern desire for control, the world's uncontrollability becomes an obstacle or an annoyance even. Bent on control, we'll likely become aggressive or angry, Rosa argues, when we come up against reality in its uncontrollable complexity. So if you want a taste of what Rosa means by uncontrollability, you could think about watching sports. That's one of the metaphors that he develops in his argument. You could also think about the storm we had on Friday. We might have known it was coming, but its effects you couldn't have predicted, but you certainly couldn't control the damage. Rosa's book begins with a more gentle image. His book begins like this, and this will be on the screen. Do you still remember the first snowfall on a late autumn or winter day? I know it's July, think hard. When you were a child, it was like the intrusion of a new reality, something shy and strange that had come to visit us, falling down upon and transforming the world around us without our having to do anything. an unexpected gift. Falling snow is perhaps the purest manifestation of uncontrollability. Rosa is a sociologist, not a theologian. He's thinking about the structures of social life. He's thinking about cultural systems and how they shape our lives as modern people. He isn't thinking about God or faith. That's not part of the argument. But we as readers are uncontrollable. He can't tell us what to do. We can read this book however we want. And if we happen to read Rosa with theological questions in mind, a wonderfully rich conversation emerges. If you and I were to picture God as the uncontrollable mystery that gives birth to the world in love, then we can also picture faith as the difficult challenge modern people like us face when we bump up against the mystery of God. So a question for today might be, how can we bear with the uncontrollable without resorting to our usual attempts to exert control? Diana Butler Bass, in her 2012 book, Christianity After Religion, names some of the particular challenges of belonging to a faith community here in the early part of the 21st century. She argues that for congregations of every size, every kind, and every tradition, in any demographic, doesn't matter, the life of faith is losing its grip, at least here in the United States, on more and more people. Now, I'm not going to say much more about her argument this morning. Butler Bass is trying to do her best to describe why church life, why belonging to a faith community feels so much more different now than it did 20, 50, or 100 years ago. The shifts are important, but Butler Bass isn't despairing about all this change. Far from it. She argues that this is a wonderful time for revival and renewal. Even in all the accelerated change, this is a time loaded with new opportunities for faith and for faith communities. Now, you get to feel any way you want to about some of these changes and shifts in our culture that make belonging to a faith community so different. Belonging to a community of faith might not be harder than it was in years past. I wouldn't make that argument, but it sure is different. And I think our scripture reading today provides a fresh angle on our situation. As people of faith, we've been invited to wrestle with God for a blessing. Now, of course, that's not the only way you can describe the life of faith. But I want to argue that this passage we're about to read from Genesis 32, that this passage is so central to our faith tradition that any description of faith that doesn't include some feature of this wrestling with God, that account of faith wouldn't be fully compelling or persuasive. So here's the proposal I want to make for all of us today. Let's wrestle our way forward. Let's summon both the courage to face our challenges in life with honesty, and let's summon the gladness that draws us together into this community. We belong to a community where we're learning to be honest with ourselves, with others, and with God. And this reading today from Genesis 32 gives us permission to feel, yes, a little bit worried, but also very excited about the possibilities of living with this kind of honesty. So come with me for a few minutes to this story of Jacob's wrestling match. In the story, we witness Jacob wrestling all night long with a stranger beside the Jabbok River. To be literal about it, what we read in the story is this, quote, "So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak." Now, a couple of images here on the screen. The first one is the painting of this biblical scene from Genesis by Rembrandt. The second is by Gustave Doré. But notice that both artists have made an interpretive decision. In both of these depictions, we see Jacob wrestling with an identifiable angel. Okay, I'm not going to criticize Rembrandt. But I will say that the story as it reads is much more ambiguous than that. Jacob does not know who or what he's wrestling. That's what makes the story so fascinating for us. Pause. We're going to read the story, but pause just for a moment for a little context. Jacob's got problems. He's had a strange life, a hard life. Many of you know this story. He's been in exile, living away from home, away from his homeland, his people for 20 years. And now as we come to the story, finally he's on his way back home. He's on a return journey like many of us. He's trying to rebalance, recalibrate, get back to the center of who he is and what matters. You might remember the telling of the way he was born. Jacob was born grabbing the heel of his twin brother Esau, trying to pull ahead. And as if being a twin isn't hard enough, his parents chose favorites. Jacob, the younger twin, was a mama's boy. He was Rebekah's favorite. But his father, Isaac, loved his twin brother Esau more. I don't know if they had therapists back then, but Jacob needed one. When our kids were younger, I would occasionally get tired of one of them asking, well, why does he get to have a sleepover this weekend? Or why does he get the bigger brownie? So sometimes I would just say, because we love him more. It wasn't always effective as a parenting tactic, but neither was anything else I tried, so why not? Usually they knew that I was just messing with him, but this was literally the dynamic in Jacob's family. There were favorites. And because Jacob's own attempt to deceive and manipulate the family situation to his own advantage when he was a young adult, Jacob wound up alienated, cast out, hated by his own family, forced to flee to a land far to the northeast. We're getting to our story. There in the northeast, he married two sisters. That's right. Keep following with the story. He married two sisters. He wanted the younger, more attractive one, Rachel. I know it is not politically correct to describe the physical attractiveness of a woman, but you kind of have to. It's part of the story. He wanted the more attractive one to him, let's say, Rachel. But his father-in-law tricked him into marrying the older, less attractive sister, Leah, first. So he marries the sister he didn't want. He agrees to work 7 more years for his father-in-law, and then finally is allowed to marry the younger sister, Rachel, too. Did I mention these two sisters hated one another and competed for Jacob's attention every single day? We have binge-watched a few TV series, and I think if someone would make this one, I would watch it. This would be good. So he had to work on his father-in-law's farm for 20 years. His father-in-law constantly cheated him out of his wages. His life spiraled down into a complete mess. And so he finally decides that the only thing left for him to do is to take his 2 wives, their 2 servants, and his 11 children and head back home to the land of his father, Isaac. Just one problem. We are going to read the story. One problem I hadn't mentioned yet. The biggest challenge of his life was that his twin brother Esau wanted to kill him. Not a metaphor, right? Not an exaggeration. Esau vowed to murder Jacob if he ever set eyes on him again. That's why Jacob left home in the first place. Okay, so now, in this part we're going to read, Jacob's headed back home. The servants report back to him, bad news, boss. Esau's headed this way, and he's got 400 armed men with him. So Jacob decides to send all his servants with lots of gifts to Esau to appease him along the way, to ask for forgiveness, to hopefully soften him up. See, Jacob's in a real bind, but not unlike you and me. God has promised to bless him, but his brother's coming to kill him. God has promised to bless him, but his life is under threat. So Genesis 32, I'll read verses 22 to 31. So listen now, friends, for God's voice to you in this reading. The same night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, this is an even match, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So the man said to him, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven or struggled with God and with humans, and you have prevailed." The word Israel means struggle. Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Any wrestlers in high school or younger? Max, anybody back here? Okay. I did not wrestle in high school, partly because I'm not tough enough, also because I don't look good in a singlet. But I have friends who wrestle. I have watched them wrestle, and it looks like a sweaty, exhausting ordeal. Wrestling matches that I've seen last a few minutes at most. Can you imagine wrestling a stranger in the dark for hours and hours on end? Near daybreak, the other wrestler, whom we do not know as an angel when we're reading the story, and whom Jacob did not know was an angel while he was wrestling, the other wrestler touched Jacob's hip near daybreak and wrenched it out of socket. This is our literary clue that Jacob is engaged with a powerful stranger. And then the stranger says to him, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." And here's why we're still reading the story after all these years. The reason this is such an important part of our faith tradition is because Jacob replies, "No, I won't let you go until you bless me." The audacity of responding that way. You probably have heard this story many times before, so you know where it was going, you know how it ends, but don't let that familiarity eclipse that this story could have gone other directions. There were other possible ways the story could have turned out. Jacob could have said something else near daybreak. He could have stubbornly just refused to let go. He could have kept fighting. He could have just given up in exhausted resignation and said, "Whew, finally, I'm done." He did neither of those things. He said, "I won't quit struggling until you give me a blessing." And so Jacob's name was changed to Israel, meaning struggle, that very night. That name, Israel, was chosen for all of God's people to signal that the only way to experience God's blessing is through adversity and hardship. Blessings only come to those who wrestle. From this night on, Jacob walked with a limp. His uneven gait was his permanent reminder that he was wrestling with God for a blessing. And this limp was the cost of being alive, alive to himself, alive to pain and to hope, alive to others, and alive to God. Now, there's no point in going around looking for pain and trouble. It will find you, friends. Don't worry. You don't have to search for it. When Jesus teaches us to take up our crosses and follow him, he doesn't intend, I don't think, that we go out seeking opportunities to get ourselves on crosses. He knows that life is full of trouble. The point is much simpler. Don't build your life around the goal of avoiding pain at all costs. A life bent on always steering clear of trouble will be a misspent life. Now, for us, this story means that the way forward will be marked by responsibility and not by resignation. Our prayers will be marked not by defeat and despair, but instead by a dedication to become more deeply human, more honestly ourselves. Like ancient Israel, we too have been invited to take responsibility for the shape of our lives, for how we respond to the challenges we face, to decide who we are before God and how we will respond and show up in life. This story has been preserved for us because people of faith are always tempted in one way or another to avoid the wrestling match. We waste our time wishing that God's blessings would just be handed to us. Or if that can't happen, we'll just drift into resignation and pout a bit. No, we need this story to remind us that it's in the wrestling that we come alive and actually find joy. There are, of course, a few ways to evade and avoid wrestling with God. Let me name 4 of them real quickly. See if you find yourself here. I can see myself in some of this. First of all, we will be tempted to move forward by just burying the past, just leaving it unacknowledged and unfelt. It's back there, just let it go. That's not what Jacob does. Jacob goes back home to face his story. He could have stayed put on his father-in-law's farm, but he goes home. Secondly, we will be tempted, of course, to blame other people. The list is long: friends who betrayed us, spouses who disappointed us, political leaders who ignored us, pastors who failed to inspire us. And here's the truth: other people can't wrestle God for you, not even your pastor. Third, we'll be tempted to place unhealthy expectations on our faith community, on our church family. Sometimes we're tempted to hide our own staleness, our own passivity in the vibrance or success of the larger group. Hey, I'm part of a vibrant church. Gets me off the hook. Belonging to a community of faith doesn't dissolve your responsibility to face your life with faith and trust and hope. It just means you get to do it with friends, and that's good news. Fourth, and finally, we'll be tempted to minimize the possibilities in front of us, to tell ourselves that all we need are slight adjustments here or there, a tweak, a slight calibration. That doesn't feel like the stories we inherit, right, from our tradition, right? These ancient texts speak to us in the dramatic language of repentance, transformation, renewal, conversion. I want to come back to Butler Bass a little bit, what it means to belong to a vibrant faith community. This is my take, people generally aren't looking for successful churches. Maybe so, okay, just stick with me for a minute, right? I think what's inviting to most people is something a little different, something like liveliness, energy, vulnerability, and honesty. I think that's different, and I think that's real, and I think it's attractive to people. And so, I'm asking you to contribute to the liveliness of this congregation, to the liveliness of your family too, and of our wider community, by making this a very personal journey for yourself. I'm asking you to reimagine your life in the framework of wrestling with God for a blessing. What Harmut Rosa, the sociologist, argues about our modern desire for control and the way that pulls our lives out of shape, that's all true. What Butler Bass argues about the failures and frustrations of faith in North America over these past few decades, all that's true. And all of this describes the arena in which God has called all of us here at Second Presbyterian to live with faith, hope, and love. There is a way forward, friends. That's the good news. The harder news is that the way forward is never easy. It's a struggle. It's a wrestling match for meaning and significance, for connection and joy. Of course, we don't have to do any of this alone. We're here together to do it together, but there isn't any magic fix. There isn't any shortcut. It's only the wrestling match. Summer always feels a bit transitional to me. I'm not a student anymore, but just that kind of hangs on. So summer feels transitional. We do a little bit more traveling. We tend to take more time off. And I don't need to remind you, as I stand here before you as your transitional pastor, that we are in a season of transition here at Second. And both Rosa and Butler Bass are pointing to an even wider horizon of transition out beyond our congregational life. The world around us is not just changing, it's changing at a pace that feels unprecedented. Everything feels sped up, and shifts in the way people live out their faith are accelerating too. And in all of this acceleration and flux, we need some wisdom. We need some clarity that we can figure out how to put our best energy into play together. I want to draw your attention to a quotation from Michael Himes. He's a theologian at Boston College. I'll put this on the screen here. I think Himes moves us in the direction of wisdom and clarity. This is what he says: one vocation, or calling, read that as calling. One vocation embraces all of our other vocations. to be a human being. We are called to be as intelligent, as responsible, as free, as courageous, as imaginative, and as loving as we can possibly be. All of my other vocations, all the many ways which I live my life, must contribute to that one all-embracing demand, that one constant vocation, to be fully, totally, absolutely as human as I can possibly be. Today, I don't really want to talk about tips and tricks and techniques required for churches to grow and flourish in a time of change. Instead, I want to talk about how much delight God takes in all of us as human beings. I want to talk about how God's love for us always pulls us further and deeper into the richness and beauty of our own humanity. And I want to talk about how hard it is to be, as Himes puts it, fully, totally, and absolutely as human as we can be. For those of us who call ourselves Christians, it is Jesus who embodies what it means to live a truly human life. And Jesus models for us a life that holds together pain and gladness, disappointment and laughter, dying and rising, trouble and triumph, difficulty and joy. I'm not clairvoyant, you know that. I can't see into everyone's head and heart. I don't know why every single one of you are here today or on any other week. I don't know exactly what you're looking for or hoping to find, but it's part of my job to take a guess. So here's my guess. I think most of us are here because we acknowledge on some level that life is tough. Life is full of mystery and beauty too, yeah, but also full of hardship and struggle. And there's something in us that feels this pull, this tug to kind of close our hearts down. But we're here. We've shown up because we know that our only hope is to do the reverse, to keep ourselves open to God, open to others around us. All the ups and downs of life function to contract our lives into something smaller and harder, and yet in faith we want to expand and soften. We desperately need God and we need each other if we're going to survive this journey, this life of faith, and if we have any hope of not just surviving it, but flourishing and finding joy in this way, that will take a continual conversion, an ongoing reorientation, a fresh framework for facing God and others. Friends, there is no joy without hardship. There is no strength without weakness. And so take this with you into the rest of this summer. There is no blessing without struggle. Amen.